Well, it's a great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to John Polkinghorne, who has been in this university for many years. John, I always start by asking when and where you were born.
I was born on October the 16th, 1930 in Weston-super-Mare, but I actually come from a Cornish family, and my family had got as far east as Somerset at the time I appeared on the scene. My father was, had 9 brothers and a sister, a large Cornish family, and my Cornish grandfather was a stonemason and had a pig and a cow to feed the family. My father, the village schoolmaster, thought my father was the cleverest boy he'd ever taught. But that father couldn't go to a grammar school in Bodmin. It was too far away and they couldn't afford the rail fare. So he left school at 14 and had actually a good career in the post office, where he came a head postmaster and so on. And we got to Weston by the time I appeared on the scene. When I was 5, we moved from Weston to Street, a large manufacturing village in Somerset, very much the firm town of the Clark family, a very benevolent family in relation to the local community. And my father was the local postmaster there. And we lived there until I was 14. And I'm going
to slow you down. You're
I'm sorry.
whizzing through your life too quickly for me.
Yes.
Several things. One is Polkinghorne. That's such a lovely Dickensian name. Is there?
Well, people sometimes say to me, "You're the solicitor in Bleak House," but that's Tulkinghorne, as I'm sure you know. It is a Cornish name. Cornish names tend to begin with tree, pod, or pen. Pod means a hollow, and Polkinghorne means chief of the iron pit.
Really?
And it's not an uncommon Cornish name, but it's fairly uncommon outside Cornwall. And though I myself was born in Somerset, I think of myself as being Cornish, part of the Celtic fringe. That's partly romance, but I think it also has a certain sort of family seed in it as well.
Okay. Now let's go back to a little more on your is there anything about your grandparents? Did you know any of them personally?
Well, sadly, I didn't know my Cornish grandparents. My Cornish grandmother was a very dominant woman, and she quarrelled with all her daughters-in-law. My elder brother Peter was 18 months old, and they were visiting them, and this must have been the culmination of some long, tense family episodes. My grandmother apparently said, "Dorry," to my mother, "Dorry, that child shall not have salt with its egg." And my father, who was an extremely mild man, stood up and said, "Mother, I see that you and Dorry aren't going to get on. We're leaving today." And then my father went back to visit his parents. We never went back there as a family. And it's a real sadness to me that I didn't know my Cornish grandparents. My mother's mother and father, I knew very well. Their family name was Charlton, which is my middle name. And my maternal grandfather was a head groom. He was very skillful with horses. He trained and rode hunters in shows for his employers, and won prizes at the White City and things like that. And was one of the most fulfilled men I've known, actually. I mean, he really enjoyed the job. He was respected by his employees. It was a deferential role, but not a demeaning role. And so there's quite a contrast between the two families, because my Cornish forebears were sort of very independent-minded, small tradesmen, I suppose you would call them, people. But my grandfather and my grandmother had been a lady's maid, so they were in service. And we saw a lot of them. And eventually my grandfather came to live with us for a few years before he died. And I was very fond of him.
And then moving down the next generation, your mother, tell us something about your mother.
Well, my mother was in a way a remarkable woman. Looking back on it, I see she wasn't the easiest of mothers to have. She was rather directive in various ways, and she would say things like, "I'm as good as a witch. I knew you were worried about something," and so on, and make you feel a little bit quivery. She was, however, she was the sort of person to whom people told things. If she weren't on a train, or the neighbours, they would tell her life story, and it seems to me, looking back on it, that on the whole she made pretty sensible responses, and more accepting responses very often than she would have done members of her own family. She was very fond of literature. She kindled in me a love of Dickens and authors of that kind. My father was a much quieter, rather like his father, I imagine. Certainly a quieter, gentler sort of man. He'd been in the First World War, and but never spoke about that really. And so he was a less obvious influence in the family. Both of my parents were religious people. We were a devout family. We went regularly to church.
Anglicans. Anglicans?
Anglicans, yes. Yes. And in Street we went, of course, to the local parish church. And perhaps the whole time we were there, certainly most of the time, there was a vicar, a chap called Richard Daunton Fear, who was a very good preacher. I remember having no difficulty in listening to him, even as a young child. I was very well behaved as a young boy, but he could make Bible stories come alive and things like that. So it was a sort of pleasure to go to church. My parents never spoke much to me about religion directly. They were too reserved, I think, about it for that. But you absorb things through the pores. It was clear that religion was important to them. And looking back on it, I can't really see a time when I wasn't, in some sense, part of the worshipping and believing community of the church. I mean, I see myself as being a cradle Christian in that sort of way.
Cradle Christians. We've come on to religion earlier, as we sometimes do, but it's not perhaps so surprising. I was a cradle Christian too, in the sense that my uncles certainly were very devout, and my mother interested in a philosophical way. But I had a great rebellion against it in my teens, late teens. Did that not happen to you?
No, it didn't. I didn't have a rebellion in that sense. I suppose the nearest I got to it, of course, I did national service. I did rather short national service. I was only in the army for 14 months because of the vagaries of the period of national service. I went in 48 and came out in September 49 in time to come up to Cambridge. And I mean, nothing very dramatic happened, but I began to use the sort of language that people use in barrack rooms in the army, which is very different from the language we used at home. And I was a sergeant instructor in the Royal Education Corps, and I used to get a little bit drunk at mess nights and things like that. Nothing very remarkable. I didn't give up my religious practice. I was a communicant during that sort of time. But I felt things were getting a bit sort of ropey, I suppose one might say. So when I came up to Cambridge, I was contacted by and taken to the Christian Union Freshers Service in Holy Trinity, beginning of Michaelmas term in 1949. And the preacher was somebody called L.F.E. Wilkinson, I know very clearly. And he preached about Jesus' encounter with Zacchaeus on the road through Jericho. And he pointed out that if Zacchaeus hadn't responded to Jesus then, since Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem to his final encounter with the authorities, he would have lost his chance, and he urged us to not lose our chance to give it our lives to Christ, and called for people to come forward, as people did in those days. And a lot of people did come forward, of whom I was one. And at the time, I would have said that was my conversion. I would have seen that as be the beginning of the real thing, so to speak. Looking back on it now, I don't see it that way. I see it as an important staging point in my spiritual life, my Christian pilgrimage. But I don't see it as being the initiation of it. I see it as a further step. But I was very much caught up with the Christian Union the whole of my undergraduate days, which I feel both to some extent grateful and to probably a greater extent regretful, I have to say. It was a rather narrow world. It was a world, I think, that had a good deal of sort of fear of enjoyment, or fear indeed of other forms of Christian belief and so on. It was very narrow and confining in that sort of way. And I learned some things from it. I mean, I do think I found a deeper personal commitment to the cause of Christ, and I came to value Scripture, not quite in the rather uncritical way that was encouraged in the Christian Union in those days, but I came to do that, and that has remained with me lifelong. Scripture has always been important to me, not as a textbook, but as a sort of laboratory note of the spiritual life, if you like. And so I have some things to be grateful for, but as I became a graduate student, as I grew a bit older and more mature, I moved away from that, and would no longer sort of see myself as as a sign that
Was this kick you?
It does kick you.
Kick you.
Yes, yes.
I was a member of OIQ at one point.
Yeah, yes.
Oxford.
Much the same, actually.
Much the same. Well, I'm sure we'll come back to this later on.
Yeah.
Just to finish with your parents, did you have any siblings?
Yes, I did. I had a brother, Peter, who was 9 years older than me. Quite different from me, a much more outgoing sort of person. He was a good pianist, for example, and things of that nature, which I don't have those gifts. He was all right at school, but not academically brilliant. I was clever little boy. As you grow older, you always have some fascinating looking girlfriends in tow, and so on. He went to the RAF, trained as a pilot, and was killed in the RAF during the war. He was in Coastal Command, and it's a mysterious event that we've never been able to sort out the details of. They went out one night, they were flying Liberators over the Atlantic. They went out one night, and it was a very stormy night, and almost certainly they were killed by the weather rather than by the enemy. But they went out for some special purpose, and we've never been able to find out what the purpose was. So that was, of course, a sad thing. I was 12 at the time, and of course I was very upset at the time, but then I recovered in the way that 12-year-old children do. And then later in life, I, of course, became much more regretful again that I didn't have a brother. And my parents, in between me and Peter, had a daughter, Anne, who had some sort of intestinal problem when she was 6 months old and died under surgery. So my parents had a sad life. They lost 2 of their children. I was the remaining one. And actually they were good about that. They didn't, as I recollect it, they didn't emphasise to me that all their hopes are now concentrated on me, because I knew that must be so. And when I had an academic career, went to university and everything, I was certainly glad, and they were glad, quite clearly, though again they didn't say this very directly, were glad that I was fulfilling something that my father might have, almost certainly would have done, if his educational opportunities had been different.
Because he was so bright.
Because he was so bright.
Was he good at mathematics?
Well, he was certainly good at mathematics. I think probably he would have. I suspect that if there's genetic elements in these things, and I'm sure there is, that I get that from my father. Yes.
That's an interesting remark. Do you think that mathematics is genetically transmitted?
Well, I think there's a degree of it. Yes, I think so. I have a grandson who's reading mathematics in Trinity at the moment, so you can see these things. Of course, there's the cultural aspect to it as well, with all these things. But I mean, mathematics is a funny sort of subject, because either you can do it or you can't. And some people just can't do it at all. And very, very clever, intelligent people just don't have that way of thinking.
But it's also something, I always used to think it was something you could do or you couldn't do, and you knew that like Peter Swinnerton told me that at the age of 2 or 3, in the bath, his mother used to set him problems to keep him quiet. But when I interviewed his current successor, so to speak, John Coates,
oh yes,
he really didn't show any real particular aptitude until his early 20s. I mean,
really, that's very interesting.
I mean, he wasn't bad at it, but there's no sign of brilliance.
Yes. That's very unusual, I think. I mean, mathematics is a fairly defined gift, and people tend to show it quite early. I was a clever little boy at sums. I tell you a little bit about my early schooling.
Tell me.
There was, of course, a primary school in the street, and it had actually modern buildings. And I went to that, and from the start, I was terrifically good at sums. You were supposed to do sums by counting shells and that sort of thing. I scorned all that. I just wrote down the answers. But I was very slow in learning to read, and my mother got worried about that. And she had a friend whose name was Mrs. Macara, who was a Froebel trained mistress, a teacher, I mean, who was teaching her own son about my sort of age at home. And Mother got me taught by Mrs. Macara. And within a very short time, I've mastered reading and became a voracious reader. And that was helpful to me. I sometimes speculate what might have happened if I'd staggered on at Hind Hayes, as the school was called. Then that was for a couple of years, and then the Clark family, all the Clarks lived around the street. They were very good in that way. They didn't go off and buy villas on the south of France or country houses in Ireland. And they stayed around, and they had families, of course, and they ran a little school, essentially for their own children, but a few selected local children allowed to come along as well. It was called the Meeting House School. It was next door to the Quaker Meeting House, and I went to that. And it was a very small school. It must have been about sort of 15 or 16 children in it at any one time. A single teacher, Miss Theobald, and it was a very good teacher, and enjoyed it. I enjoyed being taught by her, and again I learnt a lot there. I mean, she was obviously teaching different ages, but somehow she seemed to manage all that. And so that's where I went. And at that school I had what I now see as being a very important experience. If you did good work, you used to get a gold star, and it would put up against your name. And I used to get lots and lots of gold stars. It was a great sort of firmament of stars. I want to think. And then one day, Miss Theobald said, "I'm going to do something different today. I'm going to do a musical test with you. I'm going to play a series of pairs and notes on the piano, and you ought to tell me whether the second note is higher or lower than the first note." So I listened to all that, wrote down the answers, handed them in, expecting another gold star. Most of them were wrong. I don't have a very good ear for music. I've got a little bit better since those days. I usually can tell whether it's higher or lower now, but I couldn't then. And it was, of course, an important and indeed inevitable experience that you couldn't do everything. And I was she was very nice, sweet sort of person. She didn't make you feel foolish for having made a muff of things. But it was, looking back at it, I see it was a formative experience in my life.
Was that because you really couldn't tell whether it was higher or lower? Or
Yeah, I can't quite recapture it really. I still have hesitations about that. I've learnt now. Of course, if you're a clergyman, you have to wrestle with having to cope with a certain amount.
exactly.
And I fortunately had a musical wife, so that helped me a lot. But now I occasionally test myself, and I know I have to let my intuition tell me the answer. It's fatal to start thinking about it, and I get all quivery about it. And now I'm more often right than wrong. But at that time, I presumably thought then I could do it just intuitively, but obviously I couldn't.
Well, we've come on to music, which is a subject which I particularly like talking to mathematicians about, because one of the founders of my discipline, or great figures, said there are three true vocations: music, mathematics, and anthropology. This is Levi Strauss. But I've always thought music and mathematics might be well connected. Has music meant a lot to you?
Well, it has meant a lot to me, but I'm musically very uninstructed. I never learned to play anything. That in itself surprises me. My mother played the piano a bit, and she encouraged my brother to, and so he became quite a good pianist. I think that was probably because my parents recognised early on that I was going to be academically clever, and they didn't want anything to distract from that. So musical lessons might have been not the best use of time or something like that. So I regret that, but I don't think I'd have been any particular good at it. But music's important to me. I like listening to music. I especially like contrapuntal music. I mean, that's, I suppose, goes with the mathematics, it's the patterns and all that sort of thing. Bach is far and away my favourite composer, and I listen to music quite a bit. And my wife, who we'll get on to obviously in due course, was a musical person, and I'll tell you a bit more about her when the time comes. But she helped me too in that respect.
Some people work to music, or listen to music and are inspired and then work? Do you?
No, I can't do that. I mean, I dislike. If I'm going to listen to music, I have to listen to it. I don't want it as background. It's disrespectful to music, and it's distracting to me. So I absolutely never work to music. If I'm going to listen to music, I sit down and listen to it.
I interviewed a long-time friend of mine who's a mathematician at King's, Ken Moody, and he listens very carefully to music. When he has a special room where there's nothing except the music, and he listens. So that seems to be it. Whereas I often find when I really want to write something very difficult, I listen to my favourite music before.
Right. I see. That's interesting.
And it helps inspire me a bit.
when I want to write something particularly special, first of all, I must write it in the morning. I'm a morning person. I decay as the day goes on. And I must then I must have absolute freedom from distraction. I have to concentrate on what I'm doing.
Where do you write?
In my study. Well, yes, I've always written in my study company or my office in the department in those sorts of days.
Not at home?
Well, it is at home. Now it's at home. Because I've retired and Queen's doesn't give retired fellows rooms in college, so I work at home. But I have a room in the house which is a sort of study library, which is wholly devoted to that.
With a telephone and email?
Well, there is a telephone. There is a telephone there. But I don't get all that many telephone calls. I mean, of course, sometimes you get interrupted, but not very often. I don't use email, much to the irritation of many of my friends. And the reason for it is quite simple. If you write books about science or religion, you get a certain amount of unsolicited correspondence.
I bet you do.
And I'm very conscientious about correspondence. The first time somebody writes to me, even if they write me a rather crazy letter, I always write back. If it's only to say thank you for your thoughts about the Great Pyramid or whatever it might be. I would say in passing that one of the parables that absolutely fascinates me is the sheep and goats. And the thing about the sheep and goats is that neither of them knew who they were dealing with. Lord, when do we see you in prison? And so on. Visit you or not visit you. And I think that when I appear before the Lord, he's going to say to me, I wrote you a crazy letter in green ink and you sent me a reply. That's going to be my ticket. So I don't have email. I actually do have an email address, but I don't allow people to know it, and I've chosen an address which is unguessable by anybody else. Only my family know.
I hope it will remain so. Well, you can always change it. So that was a little bit. Just on writing, because that interests me. You've written many books. How do you write? Do you write longhand? Do you write with a computer?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say I love writing. It's one of my favourite occupations. Initially, if it's serious writing, and certainly if it's a book, for example, I have to write longhand. If the thought is flowing, I just can't type fast enough to keep up with. So I write it longhand, biro on A4 paper, and of course you can cross out and everything like that, which is helpful. When I've done that, I have to type it up. Of course, in days gone by, I used to have a secretary who would do that for me. Now I have to type it up myself on a PC, and I don't regret that at all. I don't naturally write good syntax, and the close attention to the text that you get from typing it up enables me at least to correct some of the mistakes in that sort of way. And if I'm writing a serious article or I'm writing a book, and I have time for it, and I'm very well organised about deadlines, so I nearly always do have time, I will set it aside for at least a couple of months and look at it again afterwards, because when you've just written something, you do tend, at least I tend, to think, gosh, that was really rather good. You look at it again in 2 months' time, you see, that wasn't really quite well expressed, and maybe that argument isn't quite right. So I'm a revisionary writer, and of course, PC, very helpful in that respect. But I love writing for two reasons, really. One is I write to find out what I think. You read things, you think about things. Ideas buzz around in your mind, maybe this, maybe that. If you have to put something on paper, you have to decide, what do I actually want to say about this? It crystallizes your thinking. John Robinson, of Honest to God fame and everything, who is a good friend of mine, once said to me, I can't write without a pen in my hand. And I knew exactly what he meant. You need that. And the other thing I like about writing is that nobody tells you what to do. You're in charge. You're in charge. Most of life, you have little compromises, a little give and take, and that sort of thing. But when you're writing, you're in charge. I like that.
That's very nice. Yeats, the poet, said that someone asked him where his poetry was, and he said, in the tip of my pen.
Yes.
But I like the second, that you're in charge. Sometimes when being urged to be collaborative in our work and to work with other people and so on, and that's nice in many activities in science and so on, but the actual creative act is not very easy to share.
No, it doesn't. The first book I ever wrote, or had hand in writing, I have to say, was a monograph that we wrote here in Cambridge called The Adams Gas Matrix. And four of us wrote it together. we had all worked together for many years. It was on a subject we were all pretty expert on. And it nearly destroyed our friendship. We each wrote a chapter and then shuffled around and rewrote the chapters on. But the arguments about do we put this in, how do we express that sort of thing, I mean, it's so irritating. Everybody is convinced they knew the right way to do it. After that, I have actually once or twice written books with other people, but basically never again.
Yes, I'm told that editing a volume of your friend's work is also a recipe for disaster sometimes.
Well, yes, of course, because you can't win it. I have edited some multi-author volumes, and you can't win with that because you accept what people tell you. Of course, that's natural. If you don't accept it, you make an enemy for life. I mean, it's a hiding thing.
Yeah. Right. Well, let's just finally on your childhood.
Yes.
Were there things outside? Your parents were careful to shelter you from diversions from your academic life, but you must have had hobbies and interests. Were you keen on games, or did you play games?
Well, in principle, I would like to be good at games, but in practice, I wasn't, and so I didn't do much games playing other than team games at school, and little later on in life playing tennis or squash with people who were as bad as I was, which was necessary. There was a certain amount of walking in the countryside in Somerset. I mean, we lived in a nice county in that respect. Did a lot of reading. I was a very, very voracious reader. And there was an excellent library in the street which the Clark family had endowed, and I would go every week to change my books and get some new books to read. I did a lot of reading. I was not a very enterprising child. I have to say. Because also it was wartime and things were a little bit restricted. Perhaps that you could do, but. My father and I used to go to cycle rides in the country and things like that. But I had a pretty quiet life, I think it would be fair to say. I mean, looking back at it, I think I rather regret that I didn't. I'm not sure what I would have done, but I wish I had a wider portfolio of recreational activities.
I mean, you were just a little early for the kind of C.S. Lewis, Tolkien era of Charles Williams era, but.
Yes, I was,
but
yes.
Were you interested in that kind of Arthurian, magical world?
Well, not particularly. I think I do remember at the Quaker school, the Meeting House school, we used to do sort of handicrafts in the afternoon, mostly knitting. I'm a terrific knitter, a plain knitter. And Miss Theobald would read a story to us. I remember reading a story and I was absolutely entranced with it. And I thought it wonderful. It went on day after day, and I realise now that it was The Hobbit.
Really?
Yeah, yes, which we were being read, and so that was my only the sort of books I tended to read, either just William books or things like that, or Percy F. Westerman, who wrote these sort of daring do type of things. Then I would mildly precociously read Dickens from time to time, under my mother's encouragement. But not forced. I mean, once you put the book in front of me, so to speak, I'm drawn into it and happy to read it.
Then after that school, you went on to the Perse, is that right?
Well, not quite. I left the Quaker school when I was 10 or 11 and went to Elmhurst, which is a little local grammar school in the street, with a pretty remarkable staff, really. I mean, it was a small school and so on, but there was in particular, there was a wonderful English teacher called Miss Pugh, and we used to
P-E-W or
P-D-U-G-H.
Yeah.
And we used to read plays, Sheridan and Shakespeare, of course, and things like that in class, and that enlarged my range. I mean, I began to engage with the drama, though it was a long time before I ever saw a play on the stage. We used to go and occasionally see the pantomime at the Bristol Hippodrome, but I hadn't seen a stage play, I think, probably until I was an undergraduate, and I'm not quite certain about that. But then, at the age of 14, my father became the head postmaster of Ely, and we moved to Ely, and after some investigation, he was advised that it would be worth a rather tedious train journey into Cambridge every day for me to go to the Perse, and I'm glad I did that, and I had...
You had a local school, didn't you? Was King's College Ely?
Well, King's School was there in Ely, but it wasn't thought much of in those days. I mean, it had a great renaissance, I suppose, 30 years ago or something like that. It was rather just ticking over there. If I'd gone to school in that neighbourhood, I would have gone to Surham Grammar School. And there's a sort of amusing story about that, because my father, first of all, went to see the headmaster of Surham Grammar School, and he brought with him a letter from my headmaster at Elmhurst in Street, which the headmaster read and said, "Your boy is obviously a clever boy. I think he should go to the Perse School in Cambridge where he have clever contemporaries." So I went there, and within a term of my going there, the headmaster of Surham turned out as the new headmaster of the Perse.
Had he known, do you think?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. It's perhaps rather self-flattering to think we had known, but it's possible. And I enjoyed the Perse a lot. It was tiresome being a trained boy, but it was endurable, even with those unreliable post-war steam trains.
So you were a day boy at the Perse?
Yeah. Well, most of the boys at school were day boys. Most of the boys lived in Cambridge. And the big thing that happened to me at the Perse was there was a chap called Mr. Seedman, Vic Seedman, who was the senior maths master there, and who was a really inspiring teacher.
How do you spell his name?
Sederman. And he was a really inspiring teacher, and he could see I was good at maths, and he encouraged me. And he used to give me, for example, work to do in the holidays, which I was glad to do. I mean, I enjoyed maths. I mean, it's an entrancing subject if you're good at it. You sort of fall in love with it. It gives you a sense of power. You know, this week I can solve an equation I couldn't solve last week, that sort of thing. So I really love maths.
Which part of maths? I mean, do you mean arithmetic or do you mean geometry?
I don't mean arithmetic. I particularly mean calculus, I think, at that stage. Algebra too, of course, but calculus particularly, which is such a clever and powerful technique. And so that really launched me in that direction. And when I did higher certificate, I did double maths and physics, and so on. And
were there other clever boys? Do you remember any?
Yes, there were certainly some other clever boys. The most outstanding boy of my particular generation of the Perse was Peter Hall.
Peter Hall?
Yeah, theatrical producer.
Dramatist.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was obviously very, very gifted. I mean, he was a clever boy. He read English, of course, but he was clever at studies, so he didn't do too much academically. When he came around to graduate, he was very busy producing plays. But I mean, he's been the outstanding figure up to the generation. And there were other sort of very intelligent boys around. I mean, it was a stimulating crowd of people to be with.
There were no downsides. There was no bullying or negative aspect to school.
Not really. No, I don't think that there was. I mean, there was perhaps a little bit more of that in Elmhurst than the Perse, because being a clever boy in Elmhurst made you a little bit more unusual than the Perse. So the usual sort of things about SWATs and all that sort of thing. But nothing really bad at either school. I mean, nothing that ever made me feel, gosh, I hate the idea of going to school today or something like that.
You continued mainly concentrating on work. I mean, you didn't do drama or politics.
Not really. I did actually play the small role of Vincentio in The Taming of the Shrew. Peter Hall was Petruchio, of course. But I wouldn't say that. Of course, one of the things that was the main downside of life at the Perse. The Perse had a lot of extracurricular activities. But if you were a trained boy, and you had to.
By train boy, you mean you had to catch the Ely train?
Yeah, yes, had to catch the Ely train. I mean, you obviously didn't have to catch a particular train, but you already had to spend half an hour, 3/4 of an hour travelling home. And if you were an hour and a half later, it's spreading out. So that tended to reduce the extracurricular activities. I didn't avail myself of those as much as perhaps might have done if we lived in Cambridge.
Right. Well, I think that takes us on to Cambridge.
Not quite. I've got the army too.
The army.
Yes. Well, I went to the army in July 1948. They had a scheme by which you could go in, if you were going to go to university, you could go in early. I went in well before my 18th birthday, you could go in early, and with the idea at that time, national service only could be a year, so you'd come out in good time for the university. They put it up while we were in, as I said a little bit earlier, they actually let those of us who come in on that scheme out just in time to go up to university. So I went to the army and did my basic training on Salisbury Plain with the Royal Hampshire Regiment. Exhausting, extraordinary. An interesting barrack room, because almost all the people in the barrack room were people who were going to university as soon as the army was over. And there were one or two people who had been to the university and were going to the army after it. So we were quite an unusual crowd of people. We had a very sort of proletarian, one might say, corporal in charge of the barrack room. And after we'd been there 3 or 4 days, he said to us, "Was you all muckers before you came in?" So we said, "We don't know what muckers means, but if you mean friends," no, we weren't. But we get on well because we were all aiming for the same thing. So I did my basic training. It was very exhausting, but certainly went up. And I discovered there an ability which I hadn't known I had. That I was a very good shot. Of course, we did shooting, and I was a really good shot. And the Royal Hampshires were keen on rifle shooting, and I became part of their team. Entered in the Young Soldiers' Cup in the British Army in 1948, and we won the cup. And I have a little bronze medal at home. It's by Private Polkinghorne on the back to prove it. So it's my one sporting triumph. I didn't carry on shooting when I came to university. It was again a little too wearisome perhaps to check out to the rifle range, but at least that was
You enjoyed shooting, obviously.
Well, yeah, well, because I could do it. Yes, I mean, I think you tend to enjoy things that you can do reasonably well. I had very good eyesight in those days. I think that's probably why I was good at it. And then I got transferred to the Royal Army Education Corps, and that was an interesting move because the educational qualification to go in the RAEC was that you had to have passed higher certificate. Now I had taken higher certificate because I hadn't got the results. And so when I was interviewed by the officer about this, I put it to him that being a major scholar of Trinity might be equivalent to having passed high school certificate, and he accepted that. But another chap in our crowd, his name actually is Brian Rees, and he eventually became the headmaster at Rugby, was only a minor scholar in history at Trinity, and the army authorities decided that wasn't good enough. So Brian had to go into the service corps. So then we went down to Bodmin, actually my hometown, I suppose, home territory. My grandfather helped to build Bodmin Jail, amongst other things. And we did a sort of 3 months training down there. The only formal teaching training I've ever had. And then we were posted to our various units. I was posted to an Army Basic Trade Centre just outside Waltham, where people trained for various crafts in the engineers or in the reaming. And my task was every fortnight to teach an introductory course in mathematics for those who were going to be electrical fitters. So I taught the same course every fortnight, which was a bit boring, but one had to do it. And of course, because it was essentially a training unit, you also had to do the regimental duties. You had to be an elderly sergeant and things like that, which was pretty difficult for me, I have to say, as a rather young 18-year-old, despite having 3 stripes on my arm, but one survived.
One of the odd things about quite a lot of the science interviews with people about your generation was the importance of either national service or the end of the war. People like Anthony Hewish and others who came back often with small bits of equipment which the army had kindly given them at the end of the war.
Well, Radio Astronomy was founded on army surplus, yes.
So one sees that Cambridge in the first or the second half of the 20th century was quite influenced by the trauma of the war and people going into it.
Yes, well, of course, I escaped the trauma of the war other than through the loss of my brother. And I always think that it's a very big division between my sort of generation, which didn't know directly the experience of war, and those generations only a few years before us, who in one way or another had seen extraordinary things and sometimes done extraordinary things. and it's just they've had experience, which one can only half imagine really.
Mm. You remind me temperamentally, if I may say so, a bit of my uncle, Richard Rhodes James, who was in
Yes,
who you may know of.
Yes.
And he was in the Gurkhas, and he fought in Malaya, not in Malaya, well he did perhaps, but in Burma.
Yes.
And just that 3 or 4 years, he's 3 or 4 years older than you, he saw things which we haven't.
Yes, absolutely.
So, shall we come to Cambridge?
I think we might come to Cambridge. Yes, I came up to Trinity. And I was part of an exceptionally talented cohort of people in Trinity, because the vagaries of national service meant that 2 years of scholars were fused into one. So there were a lot of very good mathematicians around. And you certainly learn as much from your contemporaries as you do from the Dons. And so that was very stimulating.
Tell me who they were. Or
Well, my two closest friends, or three closest friends, one was Michael Attier, who later on became president of the Royal Society.
I was going to interview him, but he said he'd been interviewed at length in detail. So.
I expect Michael has. We became very good friends, and he was my best man when I got married and so on. So he was around. And then James Mackay and somebody called John Aitchison, who joined us from Scottish universities after our first year. They were affiliated students. James eventually became Lord Chancellor, so he moved from mathematics into law. And John Aitchison became a statistician, was professor of statistics at Hong Kong University for many years. They were my three closest friends, all mathematicians actually. I mean, I had other friends you didn't know classics and historians to be by that, but my three closest friends were mathematicians. And there was another very distinguished mathematician in our year, who of course I knew, but was not so friendly with, Frank Adams.
Yes.
Who was sadly killed in a road accident, really quite young, but who was clearly an outstanding mathematician. So it was a good crowd to be around. I mean, they were.
And the teachers, I mean, Hardy was presumably dead.
Hardy was dead. Yes. Well, I was taught applied mathematics, principally by Nick Kemmer, who was and who actually became my supervisor as a research student in my first year, but then moved over to Edinburgh. He'll recur in the story. He was an exceptionally nice man, and before the war he had made very important, as a young man, he made very important discoveries in theoretical particle physics, which is the subject I came to work in. And something happened to him during the war. He was a Russian who had spent his family life in Germany and come to this country in the second half of the 30s. Very English in character, in fact perfectly English in pronunciation. But somehow or other he lost his nerve about physics during the war. And though he was still very clever and very quick to pick things up, he really didn't try and do anything or really keep closely in touch with where the action was. So he was, everybody liked Nick, but he really wasn't wholly satisfactory. I was taught pure mathematics by Abraham Samoilovich Bezikovich.
We'll get the spelling of that at some point.
Well, Bezikovich is Besicovitch. He was a very distinguished Russian pure mathematician who was an émigré and had been a fellow of Trinity for a long time. And he was an extraordinary teacher. You had problems to do for supervisions, and if you were fairly clever, in about 10 minutes or so, you've gone through the problem, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, gone through the problems, and probably you solved them all satisfactorily. Then Bezikovich would produce some tatty piece of paper on which was written, apparently very simple looking, he taught analysis, mathematical analysis, apparently a very simple looking problem. And he said, solve this. And they were fiendishly difficult. And you sit there cudgeling your brains, and he would say, I am surprised that so good a mathematician as you cannot solve so simple a little problem. I never solved one of those problems on the spot. But of course you took it away, and you worked on it during the week, and with any luck you'd bring back the solution the next week. It was a sort of painful experience, but extraordinary. The other thing I learned from him, the lectures on mathematical analysis were given by somebody called Robert Rankin. And he he was one of these mathematicians who lecture in an extremely formal style. Write the arguments up on the blackboard, speaking them with their back to the audience at the time they're writing them up. You copy them down, and that's it. And it's all set out in the formal techniques of analysis, given upside greater than zero, there exists, etc. And you see the power of the proofs, but it was hard sometimes to see a way through them. When you went to see him as a coach, he talked about a problem, he'd look at it and he'd say, is large, is small. In other words, you have to figure out the qualitative things before you start writing what is after all, in some sense, mere technique, to put that into formal language. So he was a great teacher. I remember him with great gratitude. But as I went through my undergraduate years, I got more and more interested. I've got more and more interested in the fact that you could use mathematics to understand the physical world. So I gravitated towards applied mathematics and away from pure mathematics. Possibly also because Michael Attier and Frank Adams were obviously cleverer than me, both going to be pure mathematicians. And so that's what I did. And they're a great influence, though in some sense a rather remote one. My third year I did part 3 of the maths tricourse as one did in those days, and of course I did quantum theory, and the foundational course in quantum theory was taught by Paul Dirac, who had been one of the great figures of quantum theory, and he taught it, he was a wonderful man, he taught it absolutely without rhetoric, and absolutely without any reference to what he had personally himself discovered. There were quite a lot of things he was telling you about were his own discoveries. But he laid out the argument with a sort of majestic inevitability about it. It was just like the development of Bach fugue, really. One thing leads to the next, leads to the next, and that sort of thing. And it was an extraordinary experience, which is preserved in the book he wrote, the famous book he wrote, The Principles of Quantum Mechanics, which the lectures in the book are quite closely aligned. But Jack was a sort of scientific saint, really. I mean, he was very simple-minded in some sense, very narrow, concentrated on things. There are lots of Dirac stories which are all about how Dirac brought a rather direct and simple-minded interpretation of things. I mean, the quintessential Dirac story is Dirac gives a lecture about his latest ideas. Somebody says, Professor Dirac, I didn't quite understand how equation 5 followed from equation 4. Dirac says nothing. The chairman says to him, Professor Dirac, aren't you going to answer Dr. So-and-so's questions? Dirac says, that wasn't a question, it was a statement. And that sort of thing would be a put-down in anybody else's mouth. But in Dirac, it was that's just his stuff.
I love it. I'm hoping to get his radio. John Silston was mended Dirac's radio for me. He's going to give it to me as a souvenir.
Yes.
So, I'm a great fan of the little I know of Dirac, and your successor came to my room, that's Neil Turok, and wrote Dirac's equation on my blackboard for me.
Yes.
And he tried to explain why this equation, the famous equation, is so important.
Yeah, well, and so beautiful.
Why? Can you have...
Well, it was the equation that put together special relativity and quantum theory for the first time successfully. People had been trying to do that, and they hadn't figured out how to do it. And Dirac found this extremely economic, elegant way of doing it. And it was such a beautiful equation. I feel sure he felt he hit the bullseye. But he immediately found that an unexpected consequence of his equation was that the electrical properties, electromagnetic properties of the electron are twice as strong as you would expect them to be, which was a known fact, but nobody had known why it was so. So it had that immediate bonus, and within a couple of years he also discovered that the equation implied the existence of antimatter, which was again was unknown beforehand. So it's a wonderful, wonderful equation, and it's actually engraved upon Dirac's memorial tablet in Westminster Abbey.
Is it?
What the tourist makes of it, I don't know. But
I'll have to go and have a look, because there's a short version of the equation apparently, and a longer one, I think.
Yes, that's right. Well, they've got the short version.
It also implied the existence of many of the elementary particles. Is that right?
No, not quite right. No, it was specifically for the electron, though you can use it for any spin or half particle. It didn't imply the existence of other particles in that sense. And Dirac sometimes wasn't. Dirac's concern was very much with the foundational structure of quantum theory, conceptual structure of quantum theory, not very much with the nitty-gritty of how many elementary particles there are and that sort of thing. I mean, there's a famous Dirac story which Dirac is lecturing in, when would it be? Lecturing probably in the 1950s. And he refers to a recently discovered particle, the muon. The muon was discovered in the 1930s.
Time stood still.
Yeah.
Was the great generation of mathematicians in Trinity still remembered much when you were there? I mean, the Hardy, Ramanujan, all those.
Well, of course, we all knew about them. Yes. And of course, Littlewood was still around.
Littlewood, yes.
Being a friend. I didn't get Littlewood, of course, retired from teaching when I was an undergraduate. I got to know him, of course, when I became a fellow, and he would sometimes talk about the old days. But it was, yes. I don't think we recited, so to speak, the annals of the tribe in that sort of way. But we were aware that there had been great people around.
There were some famous economists and so on at that time too, weren't they?
Yes.
Successors of Keynes and people who edited Keynes's works. And
yes, and Straffer and so on.
Straffer, yes.
Things like that, yes. So again, I only got to know these people when I became a fellow.
Mm-hmm.
But,
you presumably got a first throughout.
Yeah, I got first, and I would have been deeply upset if I hadn't. I have to say. I mean, I've always been a little bit too desiring or reliant upon those sorts of recognitions, really. So it's just encouragement to feel like or something there. But no, I got. In fact, all our crowd did. I mean, we had loads and loads of wranglers and things like that.
And did you go straight into a Trinity fellowship, or?
No, well, I went straight into being a research student. And I used to say, when I was myself the senior member of a research group, I used to give a sort of avuncular talk to the starting research students at the beginning of the academic year. I used to say to them, quite honestly, the most miserable year of my life had been my first year as a research student. I found it very difficult to get going on research. It's totally different, of course, from doing tripos problems, which I was clever. The time scale is different. A hard tripos problem, or a Besicovitch problem, takes you a week. There, months, time scale of months. Tripos problems are known to have solutions. Research problems may or may not have solutions with the things you have at your disposal. I just found it very difficult to get going. And I wasn't at all helped by Nick Kemmer, who I say was a very nice man, but had no particular
self-confidence.
Well, he didn't have contact with what was going on. So I had this very miserable year, and I didn't really get anywhere. And I just sort of stuck it out and felt more and more miserable. But then Kemmer left, he went off to Edinburgh. And Abdus Salam, who later on won the Nobel Prize in Physics, came, Pakistani theoretical physicist of great distinction. And I became Abdus's...
how do you spell his surname?
Salam.
Yeah.
And he absolutely knew where the action was. Curiously enough, he didn't give me a problem to work on, but the mere fact that he knew what was going on meant that you were in touch with things. And during my second year, I found a problem to work on for myself, and I completed it. It wasn't all that difficult a problem, but it was certainly one that was worth doing. And
is it possible to very simply?
Well, yes, I could explain what it was concerned with quantum field theory. All the theories of fundamental physics at that time, and indeed today, were quantum field theories. So you take a field and you add quantum mechanics to it. When you do that, you get a richer theory than you would with the two things separately. But you get a theory that is in danger of not making sense. It's full of infinities. And you have to do various tricks to remove these infinities and produce sensible answers for them. That had been worked out by a whole brilliant post-war generation of physicists Dick Feynman and Freeman Dyson and people like that. A program called renormalization theory. And there was a little gap in they had shown that you could remove these infinities, but they applied it to something called the S matrix, which was essentially saying that the time scale in which the interactions were taking place was infinite. Now that was not a bad approximation, because the time scale, the relevant time scale, was very long compared with the characteristic time scales of the interactions. So it was a pretty sensible approximation. But of course, these manipulations are very delicate, and it seemed to me worthwhile to verify that if you had a long but finite time scale, the thing would still work. And that I was able to do, and published that. And that formed the basis of my fellowship thesis, which I put in after 2 years. Could have 3, but I thought I'd got something to. I didn't tell my parents I was putting this in, because I didn't want them to be disappointed that I didn't get in. And I travelled back to Cambridge for the beginning of my 3rd year of research on the day that the fellowship election results were announced. And I arrived in Trinity in the afternoon to find that my name on the list.
Wonderful.
as was Michael Attia's, and as was John Eliot, the distinguished historian
Oh
of
yes.
Spain, and a couple of people in their 3rd year. And that was, of course, a great experience to become a fellow. And my parents were very, very pleased, obviously. Though it was very, very important in our family not to be uppity about success. Yeah. You know, so they were pleased, but you didn't rush around and tell the neighbours.
Very English. Well, did you know John Eliot at all well?
Well, I got to know John. I knew around the place. I mean, all the scholars tend to. You see, because in my day, when you came up as an undergraduate in Trinity, in your first year you lived out, unless you were a scholar. But all the scholars, of course, lived in, and so we got to know each other fairly widely. But and of course, you have to dine at hall every night and things like that. So we got to know each other. So I knew John moderately well. But of course, we got to know each other much better when we became fellows together. And we see each other from time to time now and catch up with the old days. So.
Tell me something about Trinity at that time. I mean, how long were you a fellow?
I was a fellow of Trinity for more than 30 years, and I thought I expected that I would die a fellow of Trinity. I was first of all a research fellow for 4 years, then I became then come back to Cambridge and become a lecturer in applied maths here, and I became a teaching fellow, and then I became a professorial fellow, and then I was long enough a fellow to become a life fellow. And when I went off into parish life, I was still a fellow of Trinity. But when I came back to Cambridge, I came back to be the Dean of Chapel in Trinity Hall. Of course, I became a fellow of Trinity Hall. And that automatically cancelled my Trinity fellowship perfectly reasonably. But sadly, I mean, it was a real bereavement not to be a fellow of Trinity. I mean, I'm still very much a Trinity man underneath. I mean, having been at Queen's and still being at Queen's, externally I'm a Queen's person. I like Queen's and I'm grateful to it, but it's scratching me a bit. I'm a Trinity man underneath.
Okay, so what is a Trinity man?
Well, first of all, there's the sort of, the weight of past glory. I mean, it's all these, feel that you're some tiny part of this enormous intellectual tradition. The great, in my own sort of bit of the academic world, to recite the names of Newton and Maxwell and Rutherford and Thomson and so on. Yes, I mean, it is a great succession. It's a very beautiful college. Of course, it's very big. And when I went to Trinity Hall, I had an entirely different college experience. But it's compensated for the fact that the congenial groups formed within the larger society. So, in some sense, the scholars as undergraduates, particularly the mathematicians, and so on and so on. So it was, I just enjoyed it very much. I was so sad in some sense that I found a lot of fellow, but I mean, it's totally unreasonable point of view to take. But there we are. I mean, so I go back there very occasionally, perhaps once a term, and it's nice to tread the court again.
I had one close friend who was a fellow, Peter Laslett. Did you know?
Oh yes, I know. Yes, I know Peter Laslett. Yes. Yes, yes, of course he's much older than me, but yeah, he was the sort of person you couldn't be in Trinity very long without knowing Peter. Yes.